welcome to This Week in Travel. I'm Michelle Robson, your host and editor of Turning Left for Less. This week I'm going to be having a look at the latest travel news, including how the strike at Terminal 5 at Heathrow is going. For the main part of the programme, I'll be taking a look at using your Avios, but in a slightly different way. So we'll look at some general tips about using your companion vouchers from American Express, and I'll also be looking at alternatives. If you can't find what you want, what are the alternatives, or what could you do if you could only find reward availability to a particular destination? So hopefully it will give you a bit of inspiration if you're feeling a bit stuck with using your Avios. This week, the strike of Unite's security staff at Heathrow Terminal 5 started. It was expected to cause quite a bit of chaos, but actually it's been a bit of a damp squib. In fact, I think the only time there's been a significant queue was when Ant and Dec took their prize winners from the Saturday night takeaway through security, which caused a bit of a backlog. But other than that, it's going surprisingly well. I should perhaps touch some wood at this point because obviously we're now coming up to Easter weekend. They've obviously got enough staff in from elsewhere and they're being very well organised. Heathrow have got their management staff in to help fill in and there's lots of extra staff in general to try and manage the queues. The Heathrow first wing, which is British Airways first class and gold card holder wing, which takes you straight into the lounge and has the separate security, this is not fully closed, which is what they initially said. What is happening currently is that the check-in area in the first wing is open, but there is no security there. So once you've checked in at the first wing, you will then have to go through one of the security channels. It seems like the fast track is not always the fast track because they're having less staff there than they would normally. They're concentrating on the main security queues. And as you probably know, there's two security lanes, a north and a south. So it's definitely worth, when you get there, trying to suss out what the shortest queue is, because sometimes it can vary wildly between north and south and also between fast track and the normal security. So don't just blindly go to the nearest fast track and think that'll be the fastest option. So that's my main advice. I would stick with the advice from Heathrow and British Airways saying get there 2 hours before short haul and 3 hours before long haul in general. I wouldn't feel like you've got to allow lots of extra time, maybe a little bit of this weekend, but I would say I wouldn't worry too much because so far it seems to be going okay. And some good news this week from London City, who have introduced the new scanners, which mean you no longer have to take liquids out of your bag or electronics, and more importantly, you can now take liquids through of up to 2 litres per item, which is a huge change from before. Currently, at most airports, both in the UK and abroad, you have to take your liquids in 100ml bottles, maximum size, and keep them all within one small bag. So you're now able to take up to 2 litres through, and there's no limit on how many of those you can take through. So you can happily trot through with a wine carrier full of wine should you wish. Obviously the problem is then if you have a connecting flight, that's not going to work unless you happen to be connecting through an airport where that's allowed, and also when you come back. So if you've taken a load of big toiletries with you, you'll have to check them in for the way back because unless you're sure that the airport there is allowing the same. There are quite a few airports now that are starting to have the new scanners. These include Amsterdam and Helsinki, for example. In the UK, Teesside Airport has also started to use those scanners as well. You may wonder what's happening with Heathrow. Well, they've been trialling their scanners since, I believe, certainly 2019. It was before the pandemic that they started. And yet they still don't seem to be any closer to announcing when they're actually planning to introduce them. I suspect this is because we don't have enough of them and they're just using the ones that they bought initially. Now, they've only got a short time to actually introduce them because the government have given a limit of June 2024 for all UK airports to have the new scanners and to have the new rules, which mean you can take 2 litres of liquids per item through security. So whatever happens, we haven't got too long away. It should only be just over a year, but I'm hoping that Heathrow might get its act together and actually use that money they're saving on not paying the security guards to introduce some scanners. And also some good news in that there's a good offer if you're looking to fly to the US during the school holidays. JetBlue is an airline I'm yet to experience, but all the reviews I've heard of it have been very positive. Flying from the UK, they're using the long-range A321, which means that it's a single-aisle aircraft, but it's all suites in business class. And they also have something called a studio suite, which is at the front of the cabin. There's two of those that are much larger, and these can sometimes only cost a few £100 extra to get those. So the offer is from Gatwick. It's not available from London Heathrow, and it's only available during August. The prices start from around £1,250 return in business class, and that's to New York. There are other places available, but bear in mind they only fly direct to New York and Boston, and so if you're seeing one of the fares to elsewhere, when you look, the chances are that the second domestic flight will be in economy, not in business class. So it depends if you're happy with that. Obviously some of them can be quite long, like from Miami, that's a 3-hour flight from New York, so you may not want to particularly take advantage of that, but certainly the New York and Boston fares are really good value, especially for what I view as a really good modern suite product, and their onboard food is supposed to be very good. It's based on small plates and farm to table, and they also have cocktails available too, so definitely worth considering the JetBlue Mint product at those prices. You can find more details below with the link to our article about it. So let's have a look at the main part of this programme, where we're going to talk a little bit about using your Avios, some alternative destinations, and also a little bit about companion vouchers. So we'll start with the companion vouchers, because I know this is something that people sometimes struggle to use. The first thing I would say is that things have changed a bit now. There's a new voucher that came in September 2021, which is the exactly the same. It's still a British Airways companion voucher, but it has slightly different terms and conditions, and you can use it for some extra things. So it gives 50% off for a single person, which is always worth considering if you can only get one seat. Yes, it will mean that you have to buy a cash seat, but it could still work out cheaper than 2 cash seats, and at least one of you gets some tier points in Avios. So always worth considering, or if you're a single traveller, it's quids in, you can finally use a companion voucher. The other thing to say is that the companion vouchers also have more availability in I-Class, so that's an extra category of fares that you can use them on. You'll just automatically see this, you won't be aware of it. However, at the moment there isn't much available in I-Class, so it doesn't really help, but usually it should mean you can see a bit more availability. Finally, there's 2 other options now to use your companion vouchers, and those are 2 other airlines, and I think people tend to forget about these. So it's Iberia, which mainly fly from Madrid on long haul, and Aer Lingus, who obviously fly from the UK as well as from Ireland. From the UK they fly from Manchester, so you could consider that. Their product is pretty good nowadays. They have a very consistent fleet in terms of long haul, in that they all have aisle access, and they have a pretty consistent fleet now with good modern seats. A lot of the flights are on an A321 long range, which means it's a single aisle aircraft, but the seats are pretty much exactly the same as on the long haul aircraft, and as I said, they're pretty good. It's probably not the most luxurious airline, I'd say, in terms of business class, but it's a solid product and you can get some substantial savings. For a start, the Avios can be less with Aer Lingus, and also the amount of cash you need can be less. So it's definitely worth having a look if you're struggling to use them on British Airways. In terms of Iberia, I know a lot of people tend to say negative things about Iberia, but actually I've flown with them long haul several times and I think they're pretty good. Again, their seat is reasonably consistent. They're generally 1-to-1 and have aisle access, and they're modern aircraft with A350s amongst the ones that they use. I find the food on board pretty good. You tend to get a lot of food compared with what you'd get on British Airways. For example, you get a selection of starters, you get a soup, you get a little nice bowl of olives with your pre-dinner drinks, and the main course selection is normally pretty good and it's very tasty. I also find the onboard drinks pretty good. Yes, they don't have champagne, but they have a really good quality cava, which, as I'm sure regular viewers will know, I always say it's better to have a good sparkling wine than a bad champagne. And the cava they serve on board is pretty good. They also have some nice gin selections and some good Spanish options, such as Pedro Jimenez sherry, if you like that one. In terms of booking your companion voucher, British Airways release their seats at 355 days before departure. If you're looking for something really popular, for example Cape Town, then you will need to phone up or be online at 12 a.m. and that's UTC, so in summertime, British summertime, that would be 1 a.m. You need to be there literally as the seats are released. Otherwise, the chances of you getting them are pretty slim unless you use something like SeatSpy or Reward Flight Finders to set an alert and you're lucky that someone happens to cancel and they re-release the seats. Even if someone does cancel, it doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily put those seats back into Avios. They could decide to just sell them for cash. So you need to phone up an office that's open. Obviously the UK office is not open at 1 o'clock in the morning, but there are several and you can find these on the British Airways Contact Us page, and I'll put the link below if you want to find those. Obviously at this point, 355 days before, you can only book the outbound flight because the inbound flight won't have been released. So how do you tackle that problem? Well, it's quite easy. You just repeat the process when it's 355 days before your inbound flight. You can either do it by phone or online. If you do it online, obviously you have to have enough Avios to buy it as a separate ticket, because normally obviously you'd only be paying half the Avios in effect for two people. So you do need to have the extra Avios, and then you can phone up and get it combined. So to be honest, it's probably just as easy if you can do it over the phone to start off with, but if not, you can do it online as well. One thing I should have said earlier is I mentioned about Reward Flight Finder and SeatSpy. If you have these, what you can do is you can use the map function, and this allows you to put in a particular date and it will show you all the destinations that are available on Avios on that date for a particular cabin, whatever you select, or if you want all of them. So that's a useful thing to find availability if you really don't mind where you go. So that's kind of the basics of how it works with companion vouchers. But what I really wanted to concentrate on is looking at destinations and what sort of things you could do as an alternative, or if perhaps you can find a destination you're not that keen on, is there something else that you could do perhaps you haven't thought of? So I'm going to start with the most widely available destination generally, which is New York. That's in terms of long haul. It's normally pretty easy to get New York on long haul because there's so many flights a day, and you can quite often get first class on this route as well. But again, you do need to be fairly quick on it. So in terms of New York, people think of New York and think, well, either I don't want to go to a big city or I've been before. I'm sure a lot of frequent travellers have been there before. But actually, I think people forget that there's a whole world outside New York that's within fairly easy reach. So, for example, one of my trips that I've got coming up is I'm going to somewhere called Fingerlakes. Now, Fingerlakes you could drive to from New York. It is quite a long drive. I'm actually flying, but it's only about an hour's flight to Rochester. And Fingerlakes is actually a really gorgeous region. It's not that far from Niagara either, so you could combine the two. If you're a wine lover or you like hiking and nature, then they're perfect for both. The area is, as you might expect, full of very narrow lakes. That's how it gets its name, Finger Lakes, because they're long and thin. And there's also things like waterfall, there's hiking trails, so a real nature spot. However, if you're not particularly the hiking and outdoorsy type, and really you'd rather have a nice glass of wine, it's actually a big winemaking region. We don't tend to get virtually any of the wine here in the UK because it's a fairly small winemaking region. But you can do tours, and there's some lovely inns, you know, the traditional kind of New England type inns with great restaurants. So that's worth thinking about if perhaps you've got a New York flight but you're not really sure if you want to spend the whole time in the city itself. You could also consider going out to the Hamptons if you're there in the summer, which is obviously their beach resort. And again, within fairly easy reach. You can even use Blade, which is the helicopter kind of taxi service, to fly there. And if you want to find a referral code to get some money off, you can have a look at the article below, which reviews Blade. So Toronto is another one, which again, Toronto and New York are not that far apart. So you might think you don't want to go to Toronto because you've been before, or you know, it's not the most exciting destination. I quite like it for once or twice, but I think once you've done it more than that times it would get a bit dull. And Niagara, a lot of people think it's just the falls, and you know, the actual centre of Niagara I find pretty horrendous. It's very touristy and a bit tacky, if I'm honest. But a lot of people don't realise there's actually another region there, which is Niagara-on-the-Lake, and that's about 20 minutes from Niagara towards Toronto. And this is a bit like Finger Lakes in terms of it's a big winemaking area. Again, it's got more of an old world charm. The actual town is very pretty. It's very oldie worldy. There's lots of little independent boutiques, restaurants, a microbrewery, pretty much everything you'd want from a traditional old town. And there's some great vineyards and really good restaurants. Again, there's some really nice places you can stay, including right on the lake. So that's well worth considering if Toronto is all that's available. So if we look at Boston next, again, this is one that's not too difficult to get flights on. It's harder than New York because there's not as many flights, but yeah, it's reasonably easy, especially if you plan in advance. So just because you've got flights to Boston doesn't mean you have to go there. There's a whole world north of Boston and south of Boston. You could go and explore New England with all the traditional villages there and the covered bridges. Particularly in the fall, it's a great thing to do, but that's very expensive at the moment. Though at least the exchange rate this week is finally getting better. The other thing you consider, perhaps just on the shoulder season, such as May, because their season tends to be a bit later there because of the weather being more like England, you could consider going to Cape Cod. Now, this is a big area with lots of different resorts, and there's also 2 islands, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. I'm actually looking at going here in May, and I've been really surprised by the prices of hotels. There aren't that many really upmarket hotels, not really sort of 5 stars, because there's not big hotels there. They generally tend to be smaller or more the kind of mid-range Courtyard by Marriott, that sort of thing. But there's some really nice hotels right on the beach with outdoor pools and charming rooms. But at the moment, less than £200 a night, which is pretty good value for the US. And some places even been under £100 a night for something that's, probably a 4-star, I would say, equivalent. So it's definitely worth considering that shoulder season. Yes, it's not going to be, hot, but it should be at least low 20s by towards the end of May, if not a bit warmer. The outdoor pools tend to open mid to end of May, so that kind of gives you an idea of when it's swimming season. But even if it's not warm, if it's sunny and you've got great seafood there, beautiful beaches, there's a lot of historic towns there and villages, great place to explore for a few days. So that's a good option if you fancy doing something different from Boston rather than staying in the city. Although if you haven't been to Boston and you're kind of put off by the thought of a big city, actually Boston to me always feels more like a town. It doesn't have that big city feel like New York. There's not nearly as many skyscrapers, and they tend to be in sort of small groups rather than everywhere. There's a lovely common there. It's on the waterfront. So I really recommend going there if you get a chance. It's one of my favourite US cities. So I'm going to stay with the US now and talk more about the South. So if you're wanting to go to Miami, for example, then actually looking at Atlanta can be a good option. Atlanta's a big hub, so it's pretty easy to get flights out of there. And I've done this before where I've flown in on Avios to Atlanta and then just got my own flight down to Miami. And the same could apply to Orlando as well. So Atlanta's a good hub to look at. You might also want to look at Tampa. Now this can be an alternative to Miami. If you really wanted like the big nightlife and the glitz, maybe it's not quite the same as Miami. However, Tampa has a lot around it. It's a good base. There's some interesting parts like the Old City, which has a good nightlife scene there and some bars and restaurants. And there's decent shopping there. It's on the waterfront, and most importantly, there's actually lots of beach resorts within an hour's drive. So you can base yourself there and also do Busch Gardens, for example, if you didn't perhaps want to do Disney. So it can be a good base and also a good starting point if you then wanted to go down to Orlando but can't get the Avios to get there. If you're looking at New Orleans and perhaps can't get the flights there and don't want to transfer through Atlanta, which again is another option, you could look at Charleston. Now you can't fly direct on Avios there. Unfortunately, British Airways have stopped those flights, but you can fly via Philadelphia, for example, or fly Charlotte as well. There's quite a few places you can transfer. And again, you might have to buy your ticket on yourself, or you could look at using your Avios on American Airlines if you don't care so much about the companion voucher. But Charleston actually has a lot in common with New Orleans in terms of the history. There's a lot of history there, there's a lot of beautiful old buildings, there's an old town area which you can walk round, it's very pedestrian friendly, that's also quite compact, and there's things like horse carriage rides and a really great dining scene there. And you can go out to the plantations as well and the old houses. And then if you wanted to carry on from there, you could also get down to Savannah in Georgia. That's about 2 hours drive. And also there's the whole coastline there with a lot of beach resorts. You might have heard of Hilton Head. That's one of the bigger areas where people go and stay in some lovely beachfront hotels. So there's a lot there to explore, not just the city of Charleston. So that's a good option if you fancy something with a bit of history that's maybe warm as well, because it's generally warm there from sort of March onwards. If we look at the west coast of America, if you were fancying Palm Springs but perhaps struggling to get to LA, you could look at Phoenix. Phoenix is also a good place to get to LA from, or Las Vegas. You could drive if you wanted to, but it's a fair old drive. It'd probably be easier to fly. However, Phoenix I really like as a destination, particularly the Scottsdale area. It's very upmarket, it's lovely and warm in the winter. Pretty much other than sort of mid-December to mid-January, it gets a little bit cooler, but it's still warm enough to sit outside. There's a lot of really fancy hotels there. Scottsdale's very upmarket. There's not huge amounts to do. You can go and drive out into the desert, do the Apache Trail. You can go up to Sedona. But it's really more of a place people go to relax. There's great spas there, restaurants. There's an old town in Scottsdale. It's quite an art scene as well with art galleries. I really like going in the winter, but I would advise you to try and be flexible, because there's a period round about sort of mid-February to mid-March where it gets really expensive, because all the football teams go and practice out there. So a lot of fans go and watch the practice games. So definitely worth trying to get up a calendar of prices for hotels and trying to pick when it's a cheaper period. They also have a lot of conferences out there which sometimes can skew the prices, and actually sometimes a weekend can be cheaper. But yeah, Phoenix is well worth looking at if you liked Palm Springs and perhaps want to do somewhere else deserty. One other thing you may want to think about is flying somewhere and then paying for your own internal flight. Flights in America are actually pretty cheap compared with what we're paying here in Europe at the moment. Even in terms of business class, a lot of the flights are around £200 for a fairly, couple of hours flight. So you could consider doing that. If you do, I would highly recommend allowing a long time between flights, not just because of delays, but if you don't have global entry, which is the quick entry system for the US, then the queues can be quite long, up to 45 minutes or even longer in the peak periods. So I would definitely either allow a long period of time, or actually what I quite often do is if I'm getting a later flight, I'll just stay at an airport hotel and then fly the next morning, and then I don't have to worry about it. And yes, you might feel it wastes a day of your holiday, but if you got to somewhere late at night, you're probably not going to do anything anyway. And airport hotels sometimes can be a bit cheaper than staying in a resort, so sometimes it can actually save you a bit of money. Now, I've talked a bit in previous episodes about this next place that I'm going to mention, so you can always have a listen back to what I've said previously. If you wanted to go somewhere in the Middle East, as an alternative to Dubai, if you're just looking for winter sun and something to relax, then I would recommend Ras Al Khaimah. This is only less than an hour from Dubai Airport and has great beach resorts, including the Waldorf. There's a Movenpick, which you may not think of as being 5-star, but it is very 5-star and has some lovely pool villas right on the beach. And they're even now building the Anantara, which is going to have overwater bungalows, a bit like the Maldives, and that's due to open soon in 2023. Another alternative would be flying to Oman. Now, you can't do this with British Airways, but you can fly with Qatar now. And that's a bit like Ras Al Khaimah in terms of the mountains, there's beaches, there's mosques you can visit that are really quite stunningly beautiful. So it's a good alternative for some winter sun and a bit of culture as well. And you could consider Abu Dhabi, which you can fly to via Dubai. And then driving, it's just over an hour from the airport, maybe a little bit longer if you get stuck in traffic. An alternative to Cairo, if you fancied doing something with some history in the Middle East, would be flying to Amman in Jordan. Now, you can fly there with British Airways and also with Royal Jordanian, who both fly direct. There's a huge amount to do in Jordan, and I was really surprised. I've been to Egypt a few times before, and I must admit I'm not a fan of Egypt, mainly because of the amount of hassle you get, particularly as a woman if you're not with a man or you're with a group of women. And I was so pleasantly surprised by Jordan. The people there were probably some of the nicest I'd met anywhere in the world. They were really friendly and genuine. Didn't get hassled at all. I walked around on my own and felt very safe, and just found people very generous and really curious to get to know you, which was lovely. You can start in Amman, and then obviously there's the city to see, but just outside there is the Dead Sea, which is well worth doing. You can float in there and cover yourself with mud and just have a really relaxing time at one of the spa hotels there. Most of the main chains have hotels around the Dead Sea, so it's definitely worth doing for something a bit different. You can then carry on to Petra. We hired a driver for the entire time, which is actually surprisingly reasonable. And then Petra, there's the old city there, which you might have seen on things like Indiana Jones. It's really quite spectacular in the middle of nowhere. So you probably want at least a couple of nights there to explore that. You can also then go and do a desert experience in Wadi Rum. I didn't do that, but a lot of people speak very highly of it. And then finally, if you want to relax again before you head back home, you can go down to Aqaba, which is on the Red Sea. So that's a good alternative if you didn't fancy Sharm el Sheikh. It's basically very similar in terms of the snorkeling and diving and beaches as in Egypt, but it's a lot more relaxed and less touristy. Some nice upmarket hotels there, including a Kempinski. It is a slightly dry country, if that makes sense, in that a lot of places don't serve alcohol, but some restaurants do, not just those in hotels. There are some outside restaurants that serve alcohol, and in fact Jordan makes some pretty good wine, which you don't really tend to get outside Jordan. So the food is similar to the Middle East in terms of your sort of meze and grilled meats, etc., and quite a lot of fish too. I really enjoyed Jordan. I'd definitely go back again if I got the chance. So that's somewhere that's well worth considering. If you fancy going on safari, a lot of people will look at South Africa or Kenya. Now, as we know, getting to South Africa on Avios can be pretty tricky. I always recommend looking at Johannesburg if you can't get Cape Town. Johannesburg, there's lots of flights, at least once an hour generally to Cape Town. It's very easy to fly between the two, and also it's not that expensive. I would say again, allow plenty of time in between your flights, because you do have to collect your luggage and recheck it in, even if you're on, for example, a connecting ticket. So definitely worth allowing, I'd say, a minimum of probably 3.5 hours, maybe a bit longer if you want to be on the safe side with the way that flights are now, particularly the British Airways A380s always seem to be running late. I don't know why. So if you're on one of those, which does fly on the Johannesburg route, then definitely allow lots of time to change onto your domestic flight. If you don't fancy going to Johannesburg for your safari, or you fancy something different and a bit better value, then you could consider Namibia. Now, you can't fly to Namibia using British Airways, however you can fly Qatar. And Qatar is very easy to book Avios flights on now. You can either book them through a Privilege Club, which is Qatar's own loyalty program, and with this it's very easy to transfer in between the two accounts. I'm not sure everybody realises this. You literally just link your accounts and then it's instant to transfer backwards and forwards, and you need to be able to do this if you want to have a look on the Qatar website, because you need to have the Avios in your account to actually see the flights that are available. The other thing I would say is it's worth looking at both British Airways and Qatar if you want to fly with them, because it can vary between the two. It shouldn't. It should be the same availability, but sometimes the taxes and charges can vary, and even the amounts of Avios. So definitely worth comparing between the two before you make a decision. In terms of Namibia, I've been there on safari. You don't get quite the range of wildlife. For example, you don't get gorillas there, but you do get most of the big five. So for example, you get elephants, you get lions, you get rhinoceros there, and also there's things like giraffes, and the sort of deer-like creatures like kudu and springbok, and also you get a lot of zebras and giraffe there. There's a lot to do in Namibia. I found it very safe. I'd say I probably felt safer there than in South Africa. It's very easy to drive. The roads are well maintained. It's quite simple because there's not a huge amount of roads. There's a lot of empty space. And as well as doing the safari, which I would go to Etosha for that, there's also a rhino reserve you can visit on the way, which is in a really nice hotel that you can stay in. There's also going to the coast at Swakopmund, where you can go and see dolphins and various other wildlife. There's great fresh oysters there. You can go on an oyster tour. And also you can do a train ride that goes from the capital in Windhoek to Swakopmund, or vice versa. It's not quite as fancy as the Orient Express, but it is fairly fancy. You get a cabin with a proper bathroom, which you don't on the Orient Express. It's got a sort of 1920s Art Deco vibe. It's got a drinks car, it's got a restaurant, and they kind of include activities along the way, like you'll stop in the desert and have sundowner drinks in the middle of nowhere, kind of seeing giraffe in the distance. And yeah, it's quite a special experience. You go and do some lion feeding. Well, you don't personally, you watch the lions being fed. And so there's a bit built in, and it's just a bit of fun, something different. And the difference in price between that and doing the Orient Express, for example, the Blue Train, is huge. So it's much cheaper. Definitely worth looking into that. So yeah, you may want to go to Namibia to do your safari. As I said, it's not as big as going to somewhere like South Africa. There's only really Etosha is the main part, and then there's a couple of reserves here and there, but definitely worth considering if you've always wanted to do safari but find it a bit pricey. In Asia, you're really restricted now with Avios if you want to use them to go to Thailand or Vietnam, for example, because you can't use your companion vouchers because British Airways have dropped an awful lot of routes. And really, you've only got Singapore and Tokyo to choose from. However, they can be good stepping stones to other places. And as I've mentioned before, Qatar actually flies to an awful lot of places in Asia. So I'd definitely be looking at whether you could use Qatar. Or if you can actually manage to get Singapore or Tokyo, which are both pretty tricky at the moment, then you don't necessarily have to stay there. Getting around in Asia I find very easy. AirAsia, although they're actually low-cost airline, they're one of the better ones, I would say. You can reserve an exit row there and have the kind of speedy boarding type experience, and it's actually pretty good. I mean, you know me, I'm not one for low-cost airlines generally, but I've flown with them a few times and thought that it was a good experience and very reasonably priced. So easy to get around. So if you could manage to fly to Singapore, obviously you could then go on to Malaysia, you could go to Thailand. Personally, my pick would be Vietnam. If you haven't been there, I think now's the time to go. It's beginning to get quite developed like Thailand is, but I think it's still at the point where it's an enjoyable experience to visit. Again, the people are lovely. They're much more reserved than in Thailand, and there's an awful lot to see. It's a big country in terms of the length of it, not necessarily the actual sort of total mass of it. So it does take quite a long time to get from one end to the other, and you will really need to fly or take quite a long time to go there between the two places. But there's lots and lots to do there. There's things like Hanoi with its French past. That was my favourite out of the cities. Halong Bay, doing a cruise there. People say it is quite crowded, but actually I didn't feel like there were lots of boats there. Yes, it's a bit commercialised, but it is absolutely stunning. Well worth going to. And as I said, now is probably the time to go before it really starts developing further. And then further down, you've got Da Nang, which unfortunately Qatar are not back flying to. They used to fly there, but you can fly internally with Vietnam Airlines. They're very reliable and reasonably priced. And around Da Nang, there's quite a few cities you can then transfer to, including Hoi An, which is absolutely beautiful. It is quite touristy now. I wouldn't necessarily recommend staying in Hoi An. I'd personally stay in one of the beach resorts. There's loads around Da Nang. It's the stretch of coast between Da Nang and Hoi An is full of places like the Four Seasons. There's a Sheraton, really great beaches there. The food's wonderful, great weather, but I would be aware that it's not hot all year round, and it does get very hot in the summer. So a bit like most places, kind of spring and autumn are good times to go, particularly around sort of May time would be my pick of the weather to go there. Hanoi is in the north of the country, and that actually gets quite cool in their winter, so I would avoid going in the winter if you wanted warm weather, and I definitely wouldn't go in the peak of the summer either, because when I was there it was incredibly hot and humid. So again, I'd probably go to springtime or perhaps the autumn if you wanted to avoid the worst of the weather. Another place you could consider from Singapore is somewhere called Bintan. I really like Singapore, and if you haven't been, I recommend going. A lot of people say it's boring, but it doesn't feel that way to me. Yes, it doesn't have the rawness of somewhere like Bangkok, but it's kind of a melting pot. That's what I like about it. There's a big Indian area there. Obviously there's Chinese, there's Malaysian, and they respect all different religions there, which I really like. They have 4 official languages, 4 different religions. They celebrate every holiday of each religion, which I really like. You know, there doesn't seem to be the tensions that you get elsewhere. Everyone seems to kind of rub along pretty well. Everything's clean, everything works. It's not the cheapest city now. It used to be pretty cheap. Nowadays it's quite expensive. But it's, you know, great hotels, lots of good restaurants, hawker centres, which are like where the kind of food courts are, and you can actually eat there and not worry about getting food poisoning because they're really well regulated by the government. So they're well worth a visit, even if that's not normally your sort of thing. And then if you want to go somewhere that's more beachy, because although they have Sentosa there, the beaches aren't quite the same because you can see all the cargo ships in the distance, which is not particularly attractive. If you want to go somewhere beachy, I would recommend Bintan. Now, Bintan's only a 45-minute ride on the ferry, and the ferry terminal's near the airport, so you could even fly into Singapore and go straight there if you wanted. There's not much to see in Bintan. There is quite a big island, but there's one area that's where all the tourist hotels are that's completely separate. So you kind of might view it as being a bit artificial, but you can go out and do things if you want whilst you're there. But a lot of people tend to go from Singapore for the weekend and just relax. There's some amazing hotels there, including my favourite hotel in the world, which is the Sanchaya Hotel. Now, I'm pretty fussy, as you might imagine. I've stayed in a lot of hotels, and this one has stayed consistently my number one for a long time. I've only been there twice, but I'd love to go back again. It's quite a different hotel. It looks like it's a colonial mansion, but in fact it was actually built only a few years ago specifically for the hotel. But it has that old world kind of charm with the wooden floors and the white columns, and a beautiful reflecting pool just outside. The gardens are beautifully manicured. And then there's 2 types of accommodation there. One is the kind of traditional Thai-looking villas, which are around a pond. Some of the villas actually have their own shared pool between a set of villas. Depends on how much you're willing to pay for the type of villa. And then my preferred option is the rooms in the main house itself, which again have this kind of colonial feel and have lovely verandas overlooking the beach and the pool. One of the reasons I like it so much is the attention to detail and the personalisation. For example, you can be walking through the gardens and someone you've never seen before in your life will come up to you and say, "Good morning, Mrs. Robson." And you think, how do you know who I am? Apparently they actually have pictures of all the guests because it's quite small. I think it's only got about less than 20 rooms. They have all the pictures up so that the staff know who you are. And things like, you know, say when you go to dinner, you always have sparkling water with lime. Once you've ordered it the first day, they'll just confirm with you, would you like the sparkling water with lime? You know, they remember what you like. And there's a lot of attention to detail with the food. For example, they make their own butter, different flavoured butters. They have the special lady that comes along in the morning with health drinks, and she'll talk about what each drink will do for you. For example, you know, a shot with turmeric, for example, for anti-inflammatory, that sort of thing. She'll give you a little shot every morning, which I think is a nice touch. They have a big Olympic-sized pool there, and you virtually never see anyone. The service is pretty much exemplary there. They'll wait on your hand and foot. They bring you, you know, face sprays, cold towels, water. You know, they really look after you well. They have 2 restaurants there. One is a Thai restaurant and one is sort of more of a general restaurant that does a bit of everything. You can go out nearby. There's quite a few hotels within a short drive. And there's also a Kelong restaurant, which is the traditional Malaysian type restaurants, or Indonesian, as that's where, in fact, Bintan is not part of Singapore, it's part of Indonesia. And these sit over the water. They're what fishermen would have traditionally had to keep their catch underneath in nets, etc., or stay overnight when they were fishing. So you can go there. It's kind of Chinese style, and it's very basic. It's not a fancy restaurant, but the food's really good, and it's a bit of a novel experience, something a bit different. It's a massive, big restaurant, but I would advise booking, and the hotel can organise all your transfers. In terms of other hotels there is also a banyan tree that used to be great. Then it went through a bit of a shaky phase, and now I believe it's been upgraded and it's back to being good. It's certainly a beautiful location. There's villas overlooking the water. Some have private pools and hot tubs. So it's definitely worth having a look at that as well if you didn't fancy the Sanchaya. If we move on to Europe, then I have a few suggestions. It's generally easier to get short haul flights, and I actually think if you're using them for the business class fares, even with a companion voucher, they're actually good value. The prices of fares now are extremely high. I mean, I was looking at Lisbon the other day, and in club they wanted £440, and it's not even that far to Lisbon. So it's becoming much better value to use your Avios and Companion Vouchers for short haul, whereas before it was always kind of felt that perhaps it wasn't that great a use. Even on economy on short haul now, it can be worth using the vouchers because they are flexible. Avios bookings you can cancel up to 24 hours before, and you can change as well for a fee of £35. So it does give you that flexibility if you're not quite sure. So personally, I do use my Avios on short haul now and the companion vouchers sometimes. So if you were looking for something that's maybe like Prague, or even Croatia with that whole kind of the old walled cities and the cobblestones, I've just written an article about Tallinn. I really like Tallinn. Although it's in the north, it's a Nordic country, very close to Finland. You can fly with Finnair, so that's another way to use your Avios. And it's very cheap when you're there. It's really good value. It's funny because Helsinki is still quite pricey. It's not as bad as somewhere like Sweden or Norway, but it is a little bit pricey. Whereas Tallinn is actually very good value and very close to Helsinki. So you can use your Avios to fly either to Helsinki, and then you can get a ferry across to Tallinn, which is quite fun. Maybe not do that in the winter, but in the summer it's quite a nice ride over and doesn't take too long. Or you can use Avios and carry on to Tallinn with Finnair. It's only a 35-minute flight. There's no business class on it, so you can just buy an economy ticket, or you could just actually pay for the ticket as well. And it's very easy airport to get through. Both Tallinn and Helsinki are very quick to get in and out. Tallinn airport is tiny compared with most airports I've been to, so it's very easy place to travel to. And once you're there, there's actually quite a lot to do. A lot more than there used to be. There's the main old city with lots of bars and restaurants, and there's also now the whole Teleskivi area, which is the kind of arts district. There's a lot of street art there, there's restaurants, there's boutiques, there's bars, there's a really nice market. There's definitely a thriving sort of foodie scene there. So I definitely recommend visiting Tallinn if you're looking for somewhere a bit different from Croatia or Prague. It's also great for the Christmas time as well, with that kind of fairy tale setting with the old buildings and the cobblestones. They have a really nice Christmas market there, so that would definitely be worth considering. If you're looking to go to Barcelona, which is a really popular place, that sometimes can be a bit tricky to get flights, so you could consider some other Spanish cities. Other cities that I like to go to include Madrid. This used to be very quiet. Nowadays it's a bit more popular since EasyJet and Ryanair have been flying there, but I actually prefer it to Barcelona. It's not as touristy. You don't get the same amount of crime generally, like pickpocketing and handbag snatching. In Madrid there is still some, as there is in all capital cities, but it's not as bad, and it's just got a much less tacky vibe to me. It's not by the sea, but obviously it's very warm. There's good cafe culture, sitting outside. If you like art, there's Picasso in the museum there. There's parks as well. There's a lot to see and do, and a great nightlife scene. So that's worth considering. If you want to go somewhere that's perhaps more like Barcelona and by the sea, I'd also recommend Valencia. Again, it's a very good nightlife, lots of really interesting bars that are a little bit different from what you might see in the UK. Great restaurants, a lot of outdoor stuff. It's near the sea, and you can easily go down the coast, either using public transport very easily, or you can drive if you wanted to hire a car. And there's lots of nice places along the coast. You could go for lunch, or you could go and see the wildlife, because there's quite a few reserves there with birds because of the salt flats. So that's a good alternative to visit. The other alternative is Seville, which is further south, and obviously it's warmer during the winter than Madrid or Valencia would be, that tend to get a bit cooler. It's got a beautiful old white town there. It's got parks as well, and it's just a very charming place. It is quite touristy, but it's not as bad as somewhere like Barcelona, in my opinion. If you wanted to go to Italy and are struggling to get to Rome or perhaps Venice, then you could consider Milan. Now, before I went, I always kind of thought it was going to be a bit boring and there wasn't that much there to see. Yes, it's not like Rome, there's not, hundreds of attractions, but it is a lot less touristy, and it does have some beautiful areas there. I also found there was a thriving food scene, as you'd kind of expect in Italy, and hotel prices weren't too bad. I stayed at the Sheraton there, which had a lovely garden, and I really enjoyed the stay there. The reviews were quite mixed, but I actually thought it was nice, and that garden really made the difference. Sitting out after I'd been out for dinner with a glass of something nice in the garden, enjoying the warm night, was really something special. So I definitely recommend having a look at Milan. And maybe wouldn't spend too long there. I think probably 2 or 3 nights would be more than enough, but it's definitely worth it as an alternative. Perhaps if you've been to Rome and are looking for somewhere different to go. I enjoyed my visit to Milan, and it's one of the airports where there's actually a lot of flights, because they fly to Malpensa and Linate airports. Then it's much easier to get flights there than a lot of other places in Italy. So you could consider using your Avios to fly there. The other thing with Milan is you could also go to the lakes from there. Lake Como and Lake Garda are within a reasonable driving distance of flying to Milan, so that's another good use of flying there. You don't necessarily just have to go to the city, or you could spend a bit of time in the city and then go to the lakes as well. Well, that's all for this week. Next week I'm going to have a look at starting collecting miles and Avios with credit cards. Which ones should you be considering? Until then, happy travels.